Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce today our keynote speaker, Michael Shellenberger. As founder and president of Environmental Progress, Michael is one of the world's leading pro-nuclear environmentalists. His efforts to date have helped save 14 nuclear reactors around the world, from Illinois to New York to South Korea, which prevented an increase in emissions equivalent to adding 14 million cars to the road. Michael is a regular contributor to Forbes, and his writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Scientific American, Nature Energy, and the Public Library of Science Biology. Michael's 2016 TED Talk on how fear of nuclear hurts the environment, and his 2017 TEDx Berlin Talk, Why I Changed My Mind About Nuclear Power, have been viewed over 1.5 million times. Michael is co-founder and senior fellow at the Breakthrough Institute, where he was president from 2003 to 2015. And he served as an advisor to MIT's Future of Nuclear Energy Task Force. Michael was featured in Pandora's Promise, an award-winning film about environmentalists who changed their minds about nuclear, appeared on the Colbert Report, and debated nuclear on CNN's Crossfire with Ralph Nader and UCLA with Mark Jacobson. Michael has been an environmentalist and a social justice advocate for over 25 years. In the 1990s, Michael helped save an old-growth redwood forest and helped force Nike to improve factory conditions in Asia. In the 2000s, Michael advocated for and helped realize an expansion of federal investment in renewables and energy efficiency. Please join me in welcoming Michael Shellenberger.
Thank you very much. Any chance that we could just dim the lights in the ballroom so you guys can just wake up a little bit more slowly? You've been up for probably longer than I have. It'll make the slides a little bit more dramatic. Thank you very much, Win Canada, for inviting me, and thank you to Anne in particular, Tina and Heather. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here. It's quite selfish for me because it's a chance to push myself to explore new material. So everything you'll hear today is fresh for you guys. My talk is called Be Like Marie, Why Women are the Breakthrough Nuclear Needs. Let's just start with the bad news. Nuclear power is in decline. As a share of electricity globally, nuclear peaked in the mid-1990s. As total generation, nuclear peaked in the mid-2000s, a half-decade before Fukushima, which reduced nuclear's total further. Now we're at risk of losing twice as much nuclear globally as we add over the coming decade. The reason is obvious. People don't like it. In a recent worldwide survey, just 28% of respondents said they had a favorable view of the technology in comparison to 60% favorable view for natural gas and 85% for solar. Nuclear is viewed as above average only in reliability when compared to other energy sources, and below average on every other metric, including safety, trustworthiness, and environmental friendliness. In the US, support for nuclear is at an all-time low. Just 44% of Americans support it, which is 18 points less than its peak of 62% in 2010. Women are the main reason for nuclear's unpopularity. In the US, 74% of men support nuclear, but only 45% of women do. Now, you might be thinking, Canada's different. And you would be right, but only in part. Ontario is the sole province where nuclear has majority support, and only barely at 54% support. In every other province, the majority is opposed. The 30% gender gap in Canada is identical to that in the United States. And after the 2011 Fukushima panic, support for nuclear among men remained steadfast, but declined among women. You can see there, support for refurbishment for women declined 49 to 41%, general support from 32 to 29%, and support for new build from 30 to 25%. The reason for nuclear's low support seems obvious. Around the world, people think it's dangerous, including in Canada, where 55% believe the word dangerous describes nuclear very well, or well, more than any other word. Is it, though? In comparison to other energy sources, it's not. In fact, according to the most comprehensive and recent study published in the British medical journal Lancet, nuclear power is the safest way to produce reliable electricity. Even unreliable forms of electricity, like wind turbines, are more dangerous than nuclear, resulting in myriad deaths, mostly unpublicized, like of these two maintenance workers in Denmark, who huddled together shortly before they were killed by a fire and by falling in 2013, just shortly after this video was taken. The reason is obvious. Nuclear doesn't contaminate the air, and air pollution results in the premature deaths of 7 million people per year. As a result, nuclear has saved at least 1.8 million lives that would have been lost to pollution. But obviously, facts like these don't matter enough, because if they did, nuclear should be the most popular source of energy rather than the least popular. Now, there's more than 40 years of study into nuclear's gender gap. At first, it was thought that women were just less informed than men. This turned out to be incorrect. Tellingly, nuclear is less popular even with female scientists than it is with male scientists. Then social scientists blamed the disempowerment of women relative to men in society. Support for this hypothesis came from the fact that various studies found that other demographic groups, particularly racial minorities, also demonstrate low support for nuclear. There could be two reasons for this. First, less powerful individuals in the society have less to gain from the system that nuclear is perceived to be a part of, or less powerful individuals in the society are just more fearful of things in general, which would apply to nuclear. And there's no doubt some truth to these hypotheses, but they can't be the whole story. Recent surveys show that where 60% of whites support nuclear, so do 58% of Hispanics, which is within the margin of error, and 50% of African Americans. While that 10 percentage point gap is significant, it is still just 1/3 less than the nearly 30-point gap between men and women on nuclear. So what gives? Why is nuclear so unpopular in general and so unpopular among women in particular? To answer this question, we have to go back in time, back to the rise of nuclear fear. In 1962, the executive director of the Sierra Club in the United States asked a young man working for him to investigate a site in Northern California where the electric utility wanted to build a nuclear plant. After the young man, David Pessinen, spent the day there, he had an epiphany. "It was a turning point in my life," he recounted later. "I had a feeling of the enormousness of what we were fighting. It was anti-life. I began to see it as the ultimate brutality, short of nuclear weapons." On his return, Pessinen told the Sierra Club board of directors that he could stop the plant's construction, but that typical conservationist arguments wouldn't be enough. To win, he said, they would need to convince the locals that radiation from the plant could contaminate them and cause cancer. Pessinen was inspired by growing public concern with radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons testing, which had been making its way into the teeth of infants. Things had changed significantly in just a few years. In 1956, half of all media stories about peaceful nuclear power in the United States had positive titles, while the other half were neutral. 4 years later, just 1/4 of the titles were positive. A big part of the reason was the fallout. "Radioactivity is poisoning your children," read a banner splashed across the cover of a January 1957 issue of McCall's, a leading women's magazine at the time. Another headline on the cover next to the wide-mouthed baby helpfully read without irony, "How to Relax in 10 Minutes." 4 years later, the journal Science published an article documenting how levels of strontium-90, a radioactive isotope produced by weapons testing, were 50 times higher in the teeth of children born during nuclear testing than before. It was still 200 times less than the levels known to cause cancer, but the study still generated headlines around the world and significant alarm, so much so that parents and mothers in particular demanded that President Kennedy negotiate an end to weapons testing with the Soviet Union, which he did 2 years later. Banning weapons testing became a cause célèbre for the burgeoning women's movement. "Men have always played irresponsibly with human life," sniffed Midge Decker in an article for Harper's in 1963, "while women have always protected it." Even so, the Sierra Club's male-dominated board of directors was taken aback by Pessinen's proposal to frighten the public about the risk of radioactive fallout. "Don't you dare mention public safety," one of them said to Pessinen. "The Sierra Club can talk about scenic beauty, and maybe the loss of scenic beauty, but not about public safety. That's not our job." Few Sierra Club directors had any problems with nuclear power plants per se. In fact, several were advocates of it, seeing nuclear as the best alternative to burning coal and oil or damming rivers for hydroelectricity. Another Sierra Club director called Pessinen an extremist. And so Pessinen quit the Sierra Club and started a new organization. His two main allies, Hazel Mitchell, depicted here, and Doris Sloan, were women. Together, they produced and distributed a report claiming that the proposed nuclear plant would create quote-unquote death dust, nuclear fallout, that would contaminate the local milk. They attached notes to 1,500 helium balloons and released them. The notes read, "This balloon could represent a radioactive molecule of strontium-90 or iodine-131. Tell your local newspaper where you found this balloon." The local dairy farmers, alarmed by the apparent danger, if not to their milk, then at least to their businesses, started donating money to Pessinen's cause. Until that moment, fears of radiation from nuclear had been largely confined to weapons, not energy. By linking the two, the anti-nuclear activists tapped fears, especially strong among mothers, that their children could be poisoned. The anti-nuclear activists eventually won the day. "If you're trying to get people aroused about what is going on," Sloan explained later, "you must use the most emotional issue you can find." By the end of the decade, the anti-nuclear faction had taken over the Sierra Club. Fears of radioactive contamination had trumped fears of air pollution. The environmental organization was soon joined by Ralph Nader, the consumer advocate, and a new group, Friends of the Earth, which was founded by the former Sierra Club executive director, David Brower. 1 million people, he claimed, die in the Northern Hemisphere now because of plutonium from atmospheric weapons testing. That wasn't true, needless to say. Said Nader in 1974, "A nuclear accident would wipe out Cleveland and the survivors would envy the dead." Nader brought anti-nuclear leaders from around the country to Washington, D.C. and trained them in his take no prisoners style of play. The same year, the new head of the Sierra Club wrote a strategy memo to the board. "Our campaign stressing the hazards of nuclear power will supply a rationale for increasing regulation and add to the cost of the industry." Over time, people came to describe and think of nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, nuclear waste, and fallout as all contaminants of nature generally and of the body specifically. Thoughts about waste had unmentioned resonances, notes the historian Spencer Wirt in his essential study, The Rise of Nuclear Fear. When some critics called radiative wastes sewage, they were suggesting thoughts of excrement. The nuclear industry itself described its wastes as products of the quote-unquote back end of nuclear fuel processing. Industry workers described radioactively contaminated objects as quote-unquote crapped up, while a psychological study found the word wastes evoked disgust. Linguistically, foul words for excrement have long been used in anger to express our emotions. The father of the atomic bomb, Robert Oppenheimer, once said, quote unquote, "The atomic bomb is shit because it is not good for anything." On every level of human thought, Wirt concluded, radioactive wastes in association with weapons were seen as filthy insults against the proper order of things. In other words, the public came to see nuclear as dirty only after it saw it as dangerous and thus immoral. The critics of our society are using nature in the old primitive way. Impurities in the physical world or chemical carcinogens in the body are traced directly to immoral forms of economic and political power, said the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who analyzed anti-nuclear activists the same way she did other cultures. Disgust, psychologists remind us, is a deeply primal emotion. We've all had the experience of triggering it. My wife and I were at a restaurant in Oakland, California recently and fell into a conversation with a friendly couple next to us. They were in the restaurant business, and after my wife described what she did, it was my turn. No sooner had I said nuclear than they both nearly shouted with agony, "Oh God, don't say that word," as though they wouldn't have reacted so strongly if I had called it atomic power instead. They seemed angry at me for having contaminated their dinner. What happened next is that nuclear's alleged danger was displaced psychologically, first from nuclear bombs to nuclear plants, then to nuclear waste, in the same way we might displace our upset at our boss during the day onto our spouse at night. All the elements of classic displacement were indeed present, writes Spencer Wirt. There was persistent anxiety about nuclear war. There was an inability to dispel the anxiety in the only genuine way, by getting rid of the bombs. Finally, there was a target toward which the frustrated feelings could redirect themselves, and all the more easily because many of the associations between bombs and reactors. Women have good reasons to be more sensitive to bodily contamination than men. Even before the science of radiation, women have known intuitively for thousands, millions of years that their children, particularly those in vitro, are uniquely vulnerable to contaminants that could threaten their health and even their lives. We shouldn't be surprised then by the late 1970s, female anti-nuclear leaders came to be so influential. One of them was Jane Fonda, one of the most powerful people in Hollywood at the time. In 1979, she produced and starred in China Syndrome, an anti-nuclear blockbuster that depicted nuclear accidents as apocalyptic and triggered a nationwide panic when a reactor in Pennsylvania melted down, hurting nobody, just 12 days later. In a documentary-style interlude, in the middle of China Syndrome, Fonda showed mothers speaking out and protesting at public meetings to halt nuclear plants, just as Ralph Nader and the Sierra Club were doing across the country. Another leader was Helen Caldicott, an Australian pediatrician who became famous for her advocacy with Dr. Benjamin Spock, the child-rearing expert, in the 1970s. Warm, emotional, and seemingly qualified, Caldicott had a flair for the dramatic. At a 1979 No Nukes rally, Caldicott carried a black coffin with a sign that read, "Babies die first." Quote, "Fetuses, babies, and young children are 10 to 20 times more susceptible than adults to the effects of radiation," she told thousands of people at the rally. What drove her? Caldicott had read the 1957 novel On the Beach about a nuclear war that was set in Australia. Quote, "It frightened the hell out of me," she told the New York Times in a fawning profile. "I'm still frightened." Caldicott's power, the Times explained, came from the fact that, quote, "She spoke not as a nuclear scientist, but as a pediatrician, a mother, and a world citizen." The headline of the Times in the upper left here read, "Helen Caldicott's Many Lives, Pediatrician, Mother, Activist." But the regional newspapers that picked up the story gave it a blunter headline, "Pediatrician Believes Babies More Susceptible to Radiation." It was the 1979 meltdown at 3 Mile Island and resulting panic that pushed Caldicott into the mainstream. Quote, "The unflinching face and urgent voice of Helen Caldicott was all over the television screen," said the Times. The Times article kept stressing this crucial point. Caldicott wasn't just qualified as a pediatrician, she was active and engaged as a mother. "We cannot remain in our laboratories, our hospitals, our offices anymore," she said. "I'm learning to teach people through love, not hate. What I do now is to appeal to their goodness as human beings on the radiation issue. They've got children, they've got bodies. I try to appeal to their emotions. Have the people who built these weapons ever seen a child die of leukemia? I have." Wait, weapons? I thought we were talking about nuclear power. The two were constantly and easily being conflated. Just have a look at this poster that terrified me as a child. It was hung in my father's food co-op, advertising the No Nukes concerts. They were initiated shortly after the 3 Mile Island accident. Now, supposedly, this is a concert aimed at nuclear power, but in the background looms a mushroom cloud with very nearly the same menacing shade of orange used on the poster promoting the China Syndrome. The campaign worked, by the way. By the 1980s, 150% more nuclear power was canceled or killed than was ever built. Now, a big part of what gave the anti-nuclear movement its energy and later its credibility was the notion that nuclear energy wasn't needed. All of the solar energy technologies that can replace fossil fuels are in hand. Some are already economically competitive with conventional sources, and many are rapidly approaching that point, anti-nuclear leader Barry Commoner said in 1975. Just a few years earlier, he was on the cover of the Time magazine. In the meantime, fossil fuels were better. Unlike nuclear, which risks long-term genetic damage, said one Sierra Club leader in 1974, coal's impacts won't be felt until generations from now. Over the next 45 years, renewables would be promoted and depicted as a way to harmonize human society with the natural world. Nuclear, even more than fossil fuels, represented humankind's break from the natural order, something the nuclear industry itself promoted ever since, with its depictions of nuclear in dehumanized industrial landscapes, rather than how it actually appears in incredibly natural ones, like Diablo Canyon in California. So the question is what to do about all this. In one way, the nuclear industry responded to 3 Mile Island and the anti-nuclear movement exceedingly well by improving safety and performance. It improved worker training, worker-machine interfaces, and management techniques in order to reduce unplanned outages and shorter planned outages in ways that lifted capacity factors, which is the share of the year that nuclear plants operate, from 55% to over 90%. These measures demonstrated not only that the nuclear industry was responsive to public concerns, but also that safety and profitability go hand in hand, which is the opposite of the message that the anti-nuclear movement was communicating. But in many other ways, the male-dominated nuclear industry let its technocratic approach run ahead of the humanism that had characterized the original vision of atoms for peace. Nuclear scientists in universities and laboratories promoted the idea that radically different reactor designs, smaller reactors, thorium instead of uranium, all manner of techno fixes would yield some kind of safety advantage that would also translate into lower costs. In reality, the data is very clear. Large water-cooled nuclear designs, whether the pressurized water reactor or the Canadian heavy water reactor there in red, are the safest and cheapest form of nuclear. And that's after decades of experimentation. And the reason is simple. They're what we have the most experience building, operating, and regulating. Worse, advocacy of radical techno fixes reinforces the sense that there is something fundamentally wrong with nuclear power. Similarly, efforts by the nuclear industry to distance itself from nuclear weapons hasn't worked. The public, especially those of us more to the left politically, continue to associate the two, albeit often unconsciously. Over the last few years, after I publicly changed my mind and persuaded, I think, most of my friends to be pro-nuclear, there's still several friends and acquaintances that just haven't been able to get over their fears and are still anti-nuclear. I just keep seeing that child all burned up, one of my friends said to me, referring to the documentary film Hiroshima. When I explained to her that nuclear plants can't explode like nuclear weapons, everyone kind of nods in agreement they get it. Their rational minds get it. But our rational minds, as everybody knows, are often subservient to our irrational unconscious. A better approach, in my experience, is to point out that our fears of nuclear weapons turned out to be unfounded. Humankind is further from the use of them at any point over the last 70 years. Just as we got better at operating nuclear plants, we got better at safeguarding nuclear weapons. The close calls, none of which were as close as their anti-nuclear publicists claim, were after the early decades of the invention of nuclear weapons. Most of all, it's impossible not to be struck by this evidence showing that deaths from wars and violent conflicts around the world, which increased steadily, you can see here, from 1400 to 1945, before plummeting. You can see we're basically back down to the death rate of 1400, which is about 95% of what it was in 1945. Even those who emphasize other factors for declining violence, whether the rise of the United Nations, greater prosperity, better education, more international trade, must acknowledge that this great peace has occurred simultaneous to the spread, not the containment of nuclear weapons. In any event, nuclear weapons aren't going away. Indeed, they continue their slow spread. Nations that feel threatened, whether North Korea or Iran, understandably seek to acquire them, despite strenuous efforts, particularly by my own country, to prevent them. The vast majority of nations just don't need nuclear weapons, either because they, like Western Europe or Japan and South Korea, are under America's nuclear umbrella, or because they, like Canada, face no external threat. My own attitude is that we just need to grow up. The world is full of dangerous things we either can't or don't want to get rid of. Many of them, including the polio virus, which we could have destroyed permanently, are now being used for things like treating cancer, and they've been proven enormously useful. Dangerous things aren't immoral. That's a childlike view of the world. The power in dangerous things can be mobilized to human welfare. Now, having said as much publicly recently, I was taken aback by how upset this view was for people, particularly in the nuclear industry. But their upset only reinforced my belief that the fear of nuclear weapons is the X factor behind continuing public opposition to nuclear energy. I acknowledge that overcoming fears of a nuclear-armed world won't be easy and will take time, but it will be far easier to persuade the human race of that than of something untrue, that the desire for nuclear energy and nuclear weapons are somehow unrelated by countries. In fact, 70% of countries that get nuclear energy want it for the weapons option, and far easier than persuading people that we will eliminate weapons in the future, which no nation which has nuclear weapons has ever shown any serious interest in doing. What does all this mean for women in nuclear? First and foremost, let's recognize that you're on the right track in being organized as women. It's not just that the nuclear industry is male-dominated. It's that nuclear power's feminine, womanly, and motherly energy isn't being expressed or felt by the public. Nuclear industry leaders, who are overwhelmingly men, are intimidated by the emotional public, and they retreat into their machines and their technical solutions, when what they need to do is lean into and invest far more into humanistic public engagement. It's not just that we need more women in nuclear, we need a more womanly nuclear. That means a far more prominent for mothers, not just women, in your movement. Women connote gender, whereas mothers connote a relationship, and a deeply primal one at that. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Mothers for Nuclear is a group started by two nuclear engineers, Kristen Zaitz and Heather Mateson, not public relations executives. They aren't scared to defend nuclear power with their children present. Why would they be? They're speaking out for their children. And they're engaged. Recently, they went to Fukushima to meet with the locals. One of them, Kristen, in the middle, was pregnant at the time. While there, they ate the fish and the peaches, which are some of the best in the world. Why? Because they care, both about the people of Fukushima and about the future of nuclear. And they understand the science of radiation well enough to know that they were safe in doing so. Humanistic actions and engagements such as that speak far more loudly than words. Second, we must stop hiding nuclear's light under a bushel. The worst example of this is the World Nuclear Association's promotion of so-called harmony with renewables. This is passive-aggressive feminine approach at its worst. Nuclear is the best way of making electricity on every metric: public health, cost, land use, waste disposal, professional development, you name it. Consider that nuclear requires just 6% as many materials, concrete and steel mostly, as solar. That means less mining, less waste, less toxicity. Which is why solar panels create 200 to 300 times more toxic waste than nuclear. And none of it, by the way, is being safely contained. Nor do the toxic elements in solar panels, such as lead, cadmium, and chromium, become less toxic over time. They're elements. Wind turbine blades are nearly as toxic. In the name of harmonizing with nature, we're destroying it, spreading electronic garbage over landscapes in the name of protecting Mother Earth. Where there's no solution for solar panels and wind turbines, after they become useless in 25 years, almost all of them are going to go to the waste dumps. Nuclear pays to store its tiny quantities of waste, which never hurts a fly. And what's with this pretending that we need solar and wind if we have nuclear? Adding solar and wind to a nuclear-heavy electricity mix in places like Ontario or France would also require increasing the combustion of natural gas. So how's that a good idea exactly? It's not like solar and wind are promoting nuclear. On the contrary, the solar and wind industries promote the idea that we don't need nuclear, as does the natural gas industry, by the way, which loves to greenwash itself with solar and wind. And that's just the emissions. The impact on landscapes is even more dramatic. Even in sunny California, it takes 5,000 times more land to produce the same amount of energy from solar as it does from nuclear. Building solar farms in California's Mojave Desert, such as this Ivanpah farm here, required killing our endangered desert tortoise, the state reptile. Wind farms in the US, meanwhile, are at risk of making the migratory white-nosed bat species go extinct. The only industry allowed to kill condors in the United States is the wind industry. Scratch the surface of solar and wind and you discover secrets and lies covering up wildlife impacts, which the two industries are usually not required to investigate, much less report. And there's no more powerful way to overcome the stigma of nuclear as dirty and polluting than to contrast it favorably to solar, wind, and fossil energy, a strategy that's disallowed by the official industry propaganda of harmony. Harmony is thus a kind of battered wife syndrome for the nuclear industry. It's blaming itself for the problems inflicted upon it. More than anything else, we have to humanize nuclear. How? By being like Marie Curie. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, the first person and only woman to win 2 Nobel Prizes, one for physics in 1903 and the other for chemistry. But more importantly than any of those recognitions, Marie Curie was the first atomic humanist. What's an atomic humanist? Someone who puts the power of the atom in service of the world, not herself. Her life exemplified her care, her courage, her passion, her commitment. Just 3 years after winning the Nobel Prize for Physics, with her beloved husband Pierre, he was run over by a trolley and killed. Devastated, Marie buried herself in her work. Eventually, she took another lover, alas, a married one. She begged him to abandon his wife, from whom he had been estranged, but she found out, and the ensuing scandal was front-page news across Europe. It was humiliating. After winning her second Nobel Prize in 1911, the cowardly Nobel Committee requested she not travel to Stockholm to accept it, fearing the negative publicity. Marie valiantly asserted her right to accept the award in person, against the committee's double standard. Let's face it, plenty of adulterous men had been awarded prizes before her. And struck a blow for women's rights. Her greatest achievement was to put the power of radiation in service of humankind. When World War I broke out, she went to the French government with a plan. She would create and oversee with her 17-year-old daughter, Irene, 200 mobile medical units, which would become known as Le Petit Curie, to use X-rays to diagnose injuries and to sterilize infected tissues. She had invented hollow needles containing what was called radium emanation, a radioactive gas now known as radon, to be used for sterilizing infected tissue. During 4 years of war, Marie's Petit Curie treated an astonishing 1 million soldiers. Did she do it for the money and the fame? Hardly. Despite the great achievements of her Petit Curie, despite her trying and offering to melt down her 2 gold Nobel Prize medals, which she said, quote, are quite useless to me, unquote. The sexist French government never formally recognized her astonishing humanitarian achievements. So let's all of us, men and women in the nuclear industry and outside of it, be like Marie, caring and courageous, womanly and manly, fighting for nuclear's transcendent moral purpose of achieving peace, prosperity, and environmental protection. As Marie said, nothing in life is to be feared, only understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we might fear less. Thank you very much. Is there time for questions? Okay, good. I'll take the gift too, but. I hope I didn't go over too much. Do we have still some time? Yeah, good. Yeah, please.
I don't have a question so much as a comment.
Yeah.
Should I throw it?
Yeah.
In the nuclear industry about 8 years ago. My daughter was 6 months old, and my mother phoned me to tell me that I would not be able to work there and have more children. So when my second daughter was born about 3 years later, not deformed, she seemed to be convinced, and now she's quite an advocate for the nuclear industry. But it is true that it is out there, and she really believed that. She was quite concerned the first time I visited a uranium mine, and she phoned me and told me that I wouldn't be able to go there, and, you know, like I should quit my job. And I said, you know, I think it's safe. They say it's safe, and I believe them. She said, well, okay, well, you'll have to take that risk then, I guess, yourself. I don't believe them, but it is true, and all of us have a role to play in just talking to people that we have in our own family networks.
Thank you for sharing that. And by the way, we'll publish this. I see some people taking photos, which is fine, but we will publish this speech with the video and the slides next week, so you can have access to all of it.
Okay, so thank you for a great presentation. In particular, I found your sort of historical account of the environmental NGO movement really fascinating. I've always, wondered what we could learn from them. They have such impact and such reach, and short of dressing up like a reactor and being out in the street, but, like what can we learn from them? It's the emotional impact, and that's what I wonder, if you could comment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I was trying to, with the speech, I was trying to strike a balance. In other words, I think that the nuclear industry right now is unbalanced. It's too masculine. It's not just male-dominated. It's too masculine, and it's too rational. It's too technological. And so to reorient that balance, we have to be more emotional. We have to be more womanly. And I say that for all of us. And I point out there's ways in which I think the nuclear industry has been kind of overly, what you might call feminine, with its sort of harmony or conflict aversion ideology, which is kind of a stop hitting me, I'm sorry, stop hitting me kind of attitude. So there's real strength in, I think, asserting the superiority of nuclear. Nuclear is the special one. It's the greatest, most important technological achievement of, for many hundreds of years. Its impact on medicine alone is extraordinary. And so I think what you see, what happened, when you interview nuclear energy and nuclear industry men who lived through that period, they say to you things, they say, well, our opponents were just so emotional. And we would explain to them that they were too emotional. I was like, how did that work for you? So we have to be both. There's this, sometimes people say things like people say, well, we have to, facts don't matter. We should not worry about the facts. We should just be emotional. Well, that's silly too, right? I think if I were, when I talk to my family or friends, I say, well, let me tell you why I care about this. I'm concerned about the natural environment. We need to lift all 9 to 10 billion people out of poverty. That's going to require a huge quantity of energy. We're going to go to electric cars. That's going to require much more electricity. So how are we going to do that without destroying the planet? Even if you don't really care about climate change, there's the land use impacts, the environmental impacts. And then I say, so let's take a look at the facts. And then you can talk about the relative, I think it's important I think that's why I show the slide showing nuclear in relationship to other technologies. People say, do you think nuclear is safe? I don't think anything is safe. I could trip and fall and die falling off the podium, right? Thousands of people die that way every year. It's shocking, right? No, but they do. People die falling. So it's a childlike, this childlike view that the world is full of good and bad things, dangerous and safe things. That's just ridiculous. Like, in fact, I shouldn't even put children down by suggesting that's a childlike view. Your child gets an earache, and you go to the doctor and you come back with the medicine and you say to your child, you say, look, mommy's going to give this medicine to you. Don't take it on your own. It's going to heal your ear, but if you took too much of it, it could be bad. You could even die, right? You say it to kids. And the kids kind of go, okay, so the dose matters. We learn about that dose matters really, really early. Our kitchens are full of knives. Grow up. Like, the world is full of dangerous things, right? I wrote an article recently for Quillette where I pointed out that there was a big debate among scientists who wanted to eliminate the smallpox virus. The smallpox virus had killed millions of people. It's a terrible virus. There was a big argument to keep it. Well, it's great they kept it, because now they're using it for all sorts of medicines. Same thing with vaccines. Where do vaccines come from? They come from the diseases that we use. So dangerous things are not immoral. It's a childlike, right? It's a silly view of the world, and I think the human race needs to evolve beyond it. Yeah. Please, you. Yeah. Is there a microphone or? Oh, that is. Oh, that's awesome. I was wondering why you were holding that box. I was like, is that my gift?
You can trust me, I play softball, so I can catch. Just speak to the box. Oh, nice. Yeah, thank you, Michael. Like sometimes we deal with the anti-nuclears, we just don't quite understand where the emotion comes from. And today you link the nuclear power to nuclear weapons, and now we finally got to the source of their led fear, because there were so many times we talked to them that it was the accidents, the nuclear plants were so safe. I just don't get it, why they are so emotional and have the few bundles and stuff. Now we get it. They are not talking about accidents. They are actually, in the back mind, they are really talking about the China syndrome, the meltdowns that caused by nuclear weapons. Actually, I watched that movie, China Syndrome. It's just a partial loss of class 4 accident. Sorry about the term. It's not going to cause the China Syndrome. It's manageable accident. Okay. The question is really, I found when we deal with the anti-nucleus, I found that they are so emotional, they're so much in their own world. I found that it might be better that we deal with the public like in the middle, like they are not so much on supporting nuclear emotionally or like strongly, because they don't quite understand that much, but they have reasonable doubt about anti-nukes. Because they sometimes I talk to them and it was like, if we all go with anti-nuclear power, then what happened with the CO2? However, they don't have enough knowledge or education of understanding to take the stand. Like, how would you suggest us, like the nuclear industry, could educate the people in the middle? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so the view for a long time has just been that people need more information, and then we would provide them this information. And then once the information was in their brains, then they would change their views. But obviously that hasn't worked. So we say, why are anti-nuclear activists so emotional? Well, is it that they're too emotional, or are we not emotional enough? I mean, I listen to nuclear industry and nuclear scientist people talk all the time, and I very rarely do I see them express their own emotions. You know, so if you, when you look at the popular culture representations of public relations people in nuclear, and one of my favorites is in the book Cloud Atlas, which is a beautiful novel. The public relations people in nuclear tend to be women. They tend to be beautiful, but cold and profit-oriented. You see it all the time. If you take a look, you'll see these images. Why are you laughing? It's not a criticism, it's an observation. This is how the nuclear industry communicators are depicted. You know, they're buttoned up, they're in business suits. It's a job for them, right? By contrast, you saw Helen Caldicott. She's in a sweater. She's a doctor. She cares about children. She's seen kids die of leukemia. So I think we need to start, when you're having an engagement with anti-nuclear folks, to explain to them what motivates you. Because I don't think that, maybe for some of you it's just a job, but I don't think you would have come all the way here and been in Women in Nuclear because it's just a job. It's a vocation. It's a life commitment. So let people see your passion. Marie Curie didn't hide her passion. Her passion was what motivated her to offer to melt down her metals. Nobody doubted her commitment. So people doubt your commitment. They doubt your passion. That's why they see nuclear representatives as robots, basically. Emotionless robots. So you have to meet the emotion with emotion. It's the opposite of the usual instinct for people in the nuclear industry. You're confronted by emotion and you want to respond with lack of emotion, but it backfires. It makes your opponents more hysterical, more emotional. So be emotional. You care just as much as they do, but you've got a more mature view. You know the world is full of dangerous things. So do anti-nuclear people. If we got rid of dangerous things in the world, we would make the world more dangerous. So let's have a more grown-up view. You know, mostly people don't ever need to hear about millisieverts, millirem, or Curies, except in the context of Marie Curie, right? And I would never say to somebody that nuclear is safe. That's a lie. Of course it's not safe. Nothing's safe. The world is not safe. It couldn't be. That's a juvenile view, right? Does that make sense? It's going to be hard because it's the opposite of how the nuclear industry trains its workers, you know? And it's because the nuclear industry is run by men. It's been suffering this battered nuclear syndrome for 50 years. It needs to heal, this industry. It's suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm serious, it is. Yeah.
Just a really quick question. Given all of the work that you've done in this area, where do you see the industry going? What's your
Down.
level of optimism? Down.
It's a mess. It's a mess. I mean, I was hoping to do research and found that it was different in Canada, you know, because we're so manic in the United States and crazy. But it's not. The public is it's the same everywhere. I interview people everywhere. South Korea, Germany. We literally fan out and interview people. I'm actually trained as an anthropologist. It's the same everywhere. And you interview people and they go, you say, well, what do you think about different kinds of energy? What do you think about nuclear? And they go, well, I don't know anything about it. You know. And you say, just tell me what you think you know. And they go, well, I think it's very powerful. Right? And if you say, is it bad to be powerful? Is it bad to have a lot of power? And then I think they'll say, no, it just depends on what you do with it. You know, so, I mean, I think that I do believe that I am, underneath all of it, very optimistic that nuclear will have a very long future, you know, but it's the new gunpowder. It's like the new gunpowder, it's the new energy source, it's the new medicine, it's everything. There's nothing, I can't think of anything quite like it in human history. You know, it's cliche to say, but it is a kind of new fire. And we don't really understand it still. I find the books that have been written on it, we don't quite understand it. And because much of the way that our thinking about it is operating at a subconscious level. And that's the level at which the nuclear industry is most uncomfortable, right? In fact, it sort of views the subconscious and the irrational as bad. You know, in that sense, and I think that even the weapons and the reaction to the weapons, it's sort of the shadow self of nuclear energy. It's the part you just want to kind of go, God, I don't want to have to deal with that. And yet it's just everywhere when you talk to people. You can throw it. It's like a softball.
Can you? Okay. Just going back to what even Ramina talked about in the first discussion today about children and how we get our first perceptions as women about science, technology, STEM careers before the age of 6, and then tying that into most children's first experience with radiation being, say, an X-ray, where you're going to an office and you're covered in a lead vest, you're told don't move and you have to wear this and it's dangerous. Do you think that would play a role in how women continue to view radiation as they grow up, if that is somebody's first experience with radiation being that dangerous, kind of feeling dangerous situation, versus having some way to have a good experience or good education about radiation before that experience were to take place?
Well, isn't the first experience of radiation being in the sun?
But this is what I mean about education, though.
Right.
Even now, the sun is taught as a very dangerous thing. You have to be covered in sunscreen. My kids go to daycare and they're slathered in it every day. Yeah. Right? So we're even taught the sun is dangerous.
Well, but we love the sun too, right? I mean, it's, people, I always say this, like, well, the sun's, radiating it. People go, well, it's not ionizing radiation, it's a fusion reactor, not a fission reactor. No, I think it's important to, so a lot of what I was getting at too in this was that there is a naturalistic fallacy going on against nuclear. And the naturalistic fallacy is that there's some things in the world that are natural and other things that are unnatural. So a nuclear plant is unnatural, but solar panels made of chromium, cadmium, and lead are natural, right? And you can see the sun bouncing off them, and so it's natural. And then the other part of the naturalistic fallacy, of course, is that if it's natural, it's good. So for a long time, I was like, how do we get people to stop having the naturalistic fallacy? And now I'm kind of like, that's just part of what we do. So I think it's more like, yeah, we're exposed to the sun. We need the sun. We literally need it to create vitamin D. Thank you. STEM women. We need the sun to create vitamin D. If you get too much of it, you could get cancer and die. In fact, millions of people die every year from skin cancer. So I think it's more like the little medicine for your child. You know, it's like there's things in the world that too much of it can be dangerous, and that's just what radiation is. If you don't get enough of it, you could be hurt. If you get too much of it, you could be hurt. So you want to find that sweet place in the middle. But yeah, I mean, you're right about the hospital, right? When my son, when we went in, when he was a baby, and we were both, my ex-wife and I were both very anti-nuclear, and he had some stomach problem. It turned out to be the flu. And they were like, here, we're going to give him a little bit of this barium. We're like, what is that? Oh, it's radioactive, liquid that he'll drink, and then we'll put him under an X-ray and look at it. And we're like, great. Yeah. And then the next day we went out and protested nuclear plants, right? So. Thank you all very much. Oh, we got one more question? Sure. That's a long toss. Woo! Nice.
Thank God that worked. I think, particularly with women in nuclear, when you talk about that the nuclear industry has got rid of the emotional aspect of our role, but I think as women, we're taught that showing emotion is a weakness. So we almost have that double hit against us. And I've come to learn that connecting with that emotion and talking to people as humans first versus as, I'm a nuclear expert or I'm here to teach you something, is that connection as humans is really what the breakthrough moment is. And showcasing that vulnerability gives us power. So I think as women in nuclear, we have to own that a little bit more strongly. And I just want to say miigwech to you to showcasing that as a man, because I think it's so important as women that we own that gift. We have that gift to connect to our emotion, and we need to see that as a gift versus as a weakness. So thank you so much.
Thank you for saying that. Boy, if you think that women are taught not to show their emotion, I mean, I get choked up when I read this stuff, and I try not to express it. Emotions are universal, but our ideas are not. The things we beliefs are not universal. In fact, it's amazing that we get the amount of agreement we get on certain beliefs and ideas, but emotions are absolutely universal. We all have them. But you're right, it's been stigmatized. I mean, I interviewed these guys, like in the 60s, I interviewed this one guy who was a nuclear industry sort of public advocate for nuclear, and he said people come up to him and they go, "You kill babies," like to his face in public. And he would sort of describe this like really laconically, and I was like, that must have really been upsetting. Yeah. I was like, you get some therapy or something. I mean, I think you would want to show that that's really that's just horrible, And so the nuclear community has been victimized. But that's not the end of the story either. You don't have to remain a victim. You shouldn't remain a victim. You can't if nuclear is going to survive. But definitely, emotions have to come first. They have to be foregrounded. But that's also not the end of the story. People still do need information, but they have to go together. There's a marriage of these things, of the masculine and feminine, of the rational and the emotional. We got to get those two things back in balance. As long as there's time, yeah.
Thank you. No
Okay, so two things I've gathered is one is obviously just presenting facts is not good enough. There is actually something called the deficit model. If you read Brian Wynn, you'll get your hand slapped as a scientist for thinking that hammering facts is going to work. The second thing is obviously now we need to open a dialogue. So what is your advice for us to open this dialogue when we're faced with, oh, it's bad, oh, it kills babies? Do we come back with, it cures cancer at times? When we're hit with Fukushima, how do we go from there? How do we convince them that these things are natural and they're studied, and although it is an emotional topic, how do we combat that, I guess?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think the first is I'm not sure that there is a dialogue right now. Mostly, it's the anti-nuclear renewables movement beating up on nuclear. It's not necessary. It's dangerous. It's dirty, and the nuclear industry either not responding or trying to respond with facts and it not working. So what the Mothers for Nuclear have done is they've become evangelical. They've advocated nuclear. They go out into the world to advocate and spread the good news about nuclear. That then inspires a response, and then that's the opportunity for the dialogue. And you know, it's interesting, they do it with their kids, and people, I've heard people kind of go, well, that's not right, they're using their kids, you know. It's like, but that's why they're doing it for their kids. There's this other thing, it's like, well, I want to be a professional woman in nuclear, so I don't want to, you know, appeal to irrational things like my motherhood. You know, we got to get over that. That's just ridiculous. If you look at the environmental movement, I hate it too. But I mean, like, there's all these people that go, well, I'm a father, and therefore I'm concerned about climate change. You know, as though you shouldn't be concerned about climate change if you're, you know, childless. But that is sort of okay. I mean, it is okay to kind of talk about why people. You know, there's a wonderful. If you haven't seen it, there's this beautiful TED Talk called "The Power of Why." So you start there. Why do you do this? Why? So I think it's helpful when you stand up and you're introducing yourself, when you're in that dialogue, to tell your story. Here's why I'm in nuclear. Whatever your true story is, that's the right story. So you know, both the Mothers for Nuclear were anti-nuclear, and then they didn't change their mind and then go into nuclear. That might have been a better story, but that's not what happened. They needed a job. They got into nuclear, they learned the facts, they changed their minds, and now they're advocates of nuclear. That's the true story. That's their why. And now they're out there talking about this because they care. You know, the care is the first part. I'm here because I care about the planet, about my family, about my community. You know, I think that probably feels very unnatural to a lot of people, but it has to come first. We'll have to see why. You know, there's this great Stephen Covey thing, is nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. The facts and the figures are really quite easy, right? Like, we have them all on our website. You can download the graphs and charts, and we've done it. It's all there for you. It's like, fine. But telling your story with, you know, truth takes a lot of courage, because you are making yourself vulnerable. You are opening your personal self up for attack. But there's power in that vulnerability too.
Thank you. Big fan, Michael, since I saw you in Pandora's Promise.
Thank you.
I work at SaskPower, and we are the province's power provider. And just talking about the dialogue, and that's exactly kind of where we're at now. Absolutely agree with like everything you've said, except that in Canada there is hope, in the sense that we have some regulatory requirements to get rid of coal. So in Saskatchewan, we're heavily powered by coal and natural gas, fossil fuel. We have a lot of coal. We also have a lot of uranium. And the funny thing is, the coal we have is probably the dirtiest, and least energy intensive. Like, you have to burn a lot of it to get energy out of it. I am not a scientist. I am a public engagement person. So sorry, I don't know numbers or anything science-y. So, but I have good friends who do. But we also have lots of uranium, and that uranium is the richest resource. So what we're doing now, what SaskPower has been doing since the 70s, is looking at uranium as a form of energy generation or electricity generation. And all of those studies have said when there's a price on carbon, it'll make a more economic option. So SaskPower has been looking at small modular reactors, New Brunswick, Ontario Power Generation, some of the utilities across Canada. We even have participation from Alberta. As you know, small modular reactors may be that more economical. There isn't a tested. We're still in the design stage. I think SNC is here to talk about their reactor, but we're kind of moving in the direction of SMRs as a potential replacement for coal, because natural gas and wind and solar, which is our plan for the next few years, isn't going to get us to the emission targets that we need to get to. So just talking about the dialogue, when you start by talking about the need, if somebody says, well, why would we even have nuclear power? They don't understand the problem we're trying to solve, right? Until we start having that broader dialogue about energy. So that's kind of the challenge we're in now, is that we need to be talking about it from that need, right? Like, yes, we're women, we have that emotional reaction, and not to, combat fear and emotion with facts. But the fact in Saskatchewan is we're not going to be able to power our industries, mining and all that, with wind and solar that aren't available all the time, right? And have a lot of consequences as well. So we also have economic impacts and that kind of thing of a coal industry going away. So there is a need here in Saskatchewan that may not exist in other provinces, but it's not as hopeless, I guess, as far as we could be on an upward trajectory, sorry, if we start to have that dialogue. So lobby your MLAs and start talking about nuclear power.
Thank you. Yeah, I support. Let me just say one. I really, and I love your passion and support the advocacy that you're doing, and might disagree about some of the small, large, because the evidence suggests that the larger reactors are cheaper. But I think that one thing I want to challenge you on, friendly challenge, is when you say, I'm not the facts person, someone else does that. So what that does for me when I hear you say that is, well, then why would I trust you? So, look, I'm not qualified to do this. I have a master's degree in anthropology. I wasn't ever very good at math or science. Why would anybody listen to me? Well, because I did take the time to look at what the facts were. So changing my mind about nuclear power wasn't just because somebody was emotional with me or something, right? There was a part where I was like, well, let me go read the World Health Organization report. They wrote the World Health Organization report so I could read it. I'm sorry, about Chernobyl. The Lancet study, I can read that. If I can read it, you can read it. So I think when you talk to people about it, you want to make sure they see your emotion, but I think they want to hear from you that, because otherwise it just sounds like it's just like, well, I'm just saying this because it's my job. It's like, no, I actually went and read the research. I've read the research, and if you have different research, I would like to see it, because I'm basing mine on Lancet, which is a really prestigious journal. And then I think you can kind of come back to the fact that we all care about the same things. But I think if you kind of don't kind of put yourself down in that way, or don't what's that?
I said challenge accepted.
Okay. Yeah, I get it. It's funny because I see it, and then I see it all the time from STEM folks, which is sort of like, they'll be like, well, that person's not qualified because they didn't get a, come on. It's not like the evidence base that supports the relative safety of nuclear, the need for nuclear, it's just not that hard. You know what I mean? It doesn't require, I really loathe the playing of the expert card. It's just as bad as playing the raw emotion card, right? So let's get those, let's really work and get those things back in balance. Thanks again, everybody.
All right, I'm all of a sudden more nervous to come up to the podium than I am to go to work tomorrow. Thousands of people die a year coming up to a podium. Thanks so much for being here, Michael. Thank you for traveling from somewhere much warmer. And thank you for your shift in mindset on nuclear industry and becoming an advocate. I'll take this opportunity to take a look around the room and encourage each and every one of you to become a proud advocate of the industry we work in. You already have your own people that trust you. Start there and work out.